All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law's weekly research seminar. We are delighted today to have Beth Noveck, who is a professor at Northeastern University, where she directs the Burns Family Center for Global Impact and its partner project, the Governance Lab, and its MacArthur Research Network on opening governance. She's the author of Solving Public Problems, How to Fix Our Government and Change the World. And in New Jersey, Governor Phil Murphy appointed her as the state's first chief innovation officer. Chancellor Angela Merkel named her to the Digital Council in 2018. She has served in a lot of policy positions, including in the White House as the first US Deputy Chief Technology Officer and Director of the White House Open Government Initiative under President Obama. UK Prime Minister David Cameron appointed her senior advisor for open government. And it seems like we will begin by talking about Parliament. So Beth, thank you for joining us.
Huge thanks. Thank you for having me. I am delighted to be here. I wish I were there in person, but such are the times we live in. So it is good at least to see you from a distance. Let me say right at the outset, I know that the custom here is to let the speaker speak uninterrupted and then ask questions afterwards, but I'm more than happy to make this a conversation. So please feel free, folks in the room. I know there are at least one person there who's actually quite familiar with the book on which this is based. So I'd welcome your feedback, comments, reactions, and please do feel free to interrupt me. I can also tell you the criticisms that you should be leveling at me, and I'm happy to discuss those. So let me dive in to say, and this will be an example that's familiar to many of you, is the, I would call it a scandal that erupted a few months ago in the UK when the report came out after a parliamentary inquiry that the government in the UK, the national government, had spent £37 billion on what was largely deemed to be a failed test and trace strategy. So what many people would agree, it was dramatic overspending on something that didn't need to got done wrong and probably didn't need to get done in the first place in the way that it was executed, not only leading to opportunity costs, but arguably leading in this case, as you see, to real sort of deaths, life and death mistakes as a result. It's not unique among the many headlines you see that come from the left and from the right about failures of government and of governance that we saw during COVID. And so we see this not just abroad, but we see it here in, repeated stories, and we only need to, shake our heads and wring our hands at the guidance or lack thereof that comes out of the CDC as one of the many failures that we've seen in how government performs. And it's taking a toll, of course, on the politics of this administration as the failures around COVID, not to mention the last administration, has really led to significant sort of decline in popularity of the current president. So I think it's emblematic of, and what we've again seen in terms of these criticisms and the frequent headlines we've seen about the failures of government and of governance, are emblematic of a broader trend, a broader phenomenon of distrust in government that is not a unique phenomenon. It's not unique, frankly, to COVID, and it really is a generation-long trend in terms of the view that government is not only not trusted by people, but doesn't deserve our trust. My colleague, Paul Light, at NYU, political scientist Paul Light, of course, has written for many years about breakdowns or failures of governance and has helped to popularize this concept, as have people like Peter Schuck, who've written extensively about failures of government and of governance, or this concept of the breakdown, as he describes it, of government not performing as well as it ought to. And you, I think, see no better evidence of that than the fact that in the first 4 months of the pandemic alone, governments, like the one that I work for in New Jersey at part-time, have spent over $100 million on outside consulting services that have really been intended to help government respond better, to be more effective, and to avoid those breakdowns. So again, it's a very long-term phenomenon, though, that's not unique to COVID. We've seen declines in trust in government over a generation, both in the United States and more broadly, with some notable exceptions in places like India, of course. But there is this long-term kind of view, again, that government does not deserve our trust. So those are the headlines, of course, and that's the kind of top line view of how people perceive government. It may be why, Obama's production company is paying for a new Netflix show that's coming out any day now called The G Word, that I assume is going to be about the marvels of government and of governance. And I think that at the same time, for those of us who do watch and study this field, we have also seen an equal number of successes. Now, let me start with some examples from my own backyard, but again, without over tooting any horns, because there are so many things we've done wrong, countless lives lost, and a lot of missteps. But there were some really bright spots, I think, in terms of the ways in which many governments did respond during the crisis. So my own team in the Office of Innovation in New Jersey partnered with a private sector tech company to stand up a COVID site, what you might call a COVID information hub, in about 3 days. And then we partnered with the state's universities to be able to take information that we were getting, government information, and translate it into plain English for people. We used data that we had from the state's 211 hotline, as well as from the questions people were typing into the search engine, in order to prioritize and put front and center the information that people most want. They told us that they most wanted. And then in addition, we partnered with the NGO, the 75-year-old NGO, the Federation of American Scientists in DC, to crowdsource a network of 600 scientists and PhD technologists, and again, science professionals, to be able to provide answers to people's medical and science questions around COVID. So if you had typed in a question into this search box, like, is my child's school open, or what do I do about my free school lunch, you would get an answer from the state. And if you typed in a question like, should I take hydroxychloroquine or should I drink bleach, you would get an answer from one of the 600 scientists participating in this Federation of American Scientists expert sourcing project. So I think these are just some examples, again, of many successes we saw around the world. Again, equal and opposite to the missteps that we saw in government, but lots of places where, even in the United States, otherwise stodgy bureaucracies known for their failures often did things right. So New Zealand and Estonia and places like that are always the success story, but you even have places like the VA, not known for its agility or innovation, which was able to do things like turn around and dramatically increase its staffing, especially of nurses and other medical professionals, to be able to fill staffing shortages on the medical side during the pandemic, and in a very agile way. Even in the UK, where they had missteps like the test and trace problem, they were able at the same time to stand up, I believe it was 7 different hospitals that kind of sprung up, these sort of pop-up hospitals that sprung up to ensure that they had capacity to respond in the event of overages in normal hospitals during the pandemic. Again, the question in the headline asks here, was it worth it? But I'm putting forward the fact that they were able to do it and to execute quickly and with agility that was really, I think, quite remarkable and admirable. And there are lots, again, of these stories, and people who are governance watchers have been looking at these success stories, these positive deviants, if you will, who have been able to respond in ways that actually worked, especially during the crisis. So I think COVID really highlighted for us a certain playbook, a new way of working, if you will. This centers around a different set of skills, namely learning how to be agile and rapid in one's response, to focus very squarely on the problem to be solved, using data and evidence in the process, as well as learning how to get smart with and engage with communities to be more equitable and more legitimate in how we do things, not only more efficient, and to learn how to borrow from models of what works elsewhere to implement things quickly that can actually work. So what it does for us is, I think it highlights and it brings out something that long predates COVID, but the notion that we need to focus on the skills that people have in government, and I would argue also outside of government, but especially within government, the way that we remedy these challenges of trust, I think, is to focus not only on the broader systemic political issues, which we can get into, but on the very tactical, practical question of the skills that individuals use to be able to solve problems more effectively. So I'm not alone in sort of talking about or focusing on skills. The OECD has done work in this space. Bloomberg Philanthropy supports work on skill building. There's obviously a lot of work done around skill building, particularly in other governments, as I'll talk about. But what I try to do in my book is to make the argument that we are not going to remedy the crisis of trust in government. We're not going to address the breakdowns and the failures that Peter Schuck and Paul Light talk about if we don't actually upskill the public workforce for the 21st century. So we are relentlessly in every headline focusing on the future of work in the private sector. In fact, I just had a press release out today about the state of New Jersey's new Future of Work Task Force, which talks all about how workers in the private sector need to respond to the challenges of technology. But we actually very rarely talk about the future of work for the public sector. And I might add as a side note to this, that our federal government has no training strategy. It has no vision for what the skills are that people need to know in the public sector to be more responsive in the 21st century. So I think there's a huge gap in our policy in how we think about skills in government at the federal level, but surely at the state and the local level, where there's very little time or attention paid to these questions. As a state public servant, well, as a state public servant, let me put it that way, I'm 1 foot in and 1 foot outside of government. I am required to take sexual harassment training every year. I am required to take active shooter training every year, and I'm required to take cybersecurity training. But in nothing that I do am I required to learn how to deliver better services to the people I serve, and in no way am I required to learn how do I use data or evidence to be able to do things better. In no way and in no time am I required to learn how to be more equitable and human-centered in the way that I do things. So the argument that I'm putting to you today is that we need to have a focus on skills and on changing how we upskill people in the public sector. So let me spend a few minutes talking about what those skills look like, what I think those skills are. I think we can, again, have some disagreement about what are the right skills and approaches. But in short, I break them down really, and this is an adapted version of a problem-solving pathway that will look similar in some ways to what Frank and Jeremy use in their teaching. I think you guys use 3 circles. I borrowed some circles, but I made my circles look like the New York subway, which is sort of belies where I come from. But I think we all like the circles here. And I think we in turn have borrowed this from other people who have really talked about the iterative nature of this process of problem solving. And I really try to focus on the ways in which we can use both data and collective intelligence, or what we might just think of as public engagement, but how we think about getting smart from data and getting smart from people at each stage in the process. So first, this starts with questions of how do we get smarter about what the problem is using data? So I happened to be in Sandy Pentland's lab recently, so I stole this slide of something he sent to me about work that his lab is doing to use data and to use the machine learning that helps making them to make sense of data, that helps us, of course, understand what problems are and how they exist on the ground by getting granular and looking closely at the data. That data, though, often needs to get combined with human collaboration and engagement, like they've done in Louisville, Kentucky, where they have given GPS trackers to people suffering from asthma all over the city in order to gather that more granular data. Those GPS trackers report back on when people use their asthma inhaler as opposed to who has asthma. And this has allowed them to dramatically bring down rates of asthma in the city by identifying where are the places that people actually have to use their inhaler. So you get the idea. It's the combination of data and collaboration that helps you get smarter about conditions on the ground. But of course, we can also use new technology to help us talk to people in ways that are cheaper and easier. So that Future of Work Task Force report that came out, here's a story that was in the paper this morning about our task force report. And one of the things that it reports on the state's Future of Work strategy is that we actually went out and talked to 4,000 workers. It took us about 2 weeks to hear from them. It was very quick and easy, but we used new technology to actually ask workers, what are your concerns about the impact of technology on your job? And it was not, in fact, and what we learned from people, contrary to what we assumed going into it, was people are not worried that the robots are going to eat their jobs. They're worried about how they're going to pay for their childcare so that they can go and get training to prepare for that future of work. And so as a result, we developed policies like a $10 million pilot program to pay for low-income worker upskilling that will roll out in the next few weeks. So the ability to be responsive based on what people are telling us. And since this is a more global group, I thought I'd show one last example, this one from Taiwan that's probably very familiar to you, is the ways in which, of course, the Chief Technology Officer in Taiwan, Audrey Tang, has been using technology and face-to-face engagement to learn from people what are the challenges on the ground as they are experiencing them, to use, again, technology to understand what those perspectives are, and then in turn to craft 26 pieces of national legislation in a program that is known as the V-Taiwan Project. So of course, this process of defining and identifying the problem with data and with engagement is an iterative process of peeling back the layers of the onion to go from a very big issue into the root causes of that issue in a way in which we can take action on it. And it is a very difficult process, and it is one that actually I think can be taught and that we do need to teach, because it's not a discipline, in my experience, that most people have. We need that right-sized problem definition to be able in turn to engage more people in helping us to solve the problem. So whether it's a United States digital response that has sprung up during COVID to be able to provide volunteer help and expertise to people in government, or whether it's your class at Stanford that does this and provides, again, help to government, you need a problem that you're trying to solve. So that problem definition piece is, I think, extraordinarily important, which is why I'm spending so much time on it. It's, of course, important to be able to learn how not to define the problem as the absence of the solution. So I had a student do a problem definition exercise this week, and of course, he came back to me, and I see this all the time. The problem with education in this school district XYZ is they don't have this assessment, was the essential essence of his assignment. Of course, jumping right away to the solution and not stopping to say, what is the problem to which the assessment is actually the response. So it's a hard skill in my experience, and one that people are, including myself, never have the discipline to apply to our own work unless we have occasion to do so. So let me breeze through some of these other skills, not to give them short shrift, they're not less important, but the problem definition is the one, in my experience, that so readily gets neglected by people. We can, however, use data and engagement to help us defining and determining solutions as well. So you probably all know this quote, there's stuff that's out there that's been tried, and we need to really hone our ability to go out and find those models. In New Jersey, because we needed to know where this virus was spreading and we didn't have data to give us that information, we had to go out and crowdsource that data so we could develop the predictive analytics. So we called up Kerala, India, and we said, tell us about the symptom tracker that you built 2 weeks ago. Can we have the code for it? And can you explain to us how you did it? And then we stood up our own symptom tracker in a day, and 500,000 people gave us real-time data that allowed us to predict the spread of the virus. And as a result, never, again, plenty of mistakes, but we never ran out of ventilators because we could always get the ventilators to the place we needed them ahead of the virus because we had this real-time source of data. So I think there's extraordinarily important to learn, how do we find the Kerala Indias of the world? How do we find those examples of what work? You probably saw this piece in the Times this week that came from the wonderful John Lavis from British Columbia, who has been really one of the pathfinders in terms of helping to develop evidence clearinghouses. So this article was actually not about Joe Rogan. It's Joe Rogan, and if you got to the end, it then said, and it's really important to have evidence-based clearinghouses so that we can actually find examples of what works. And they have been building those things in Canada. to be able to help people find, for example, randomized control trials that give evidence of interventions that have worked in other jurisdictions. But there are also examples of what works that don't come from the academic literature. There are, of course, things like an MIT Solve or a challenge.gov, these kind of challenge platforms that provide great examples and databases of solutions that have been tried elsewhere. And I think it's really important for us to develop a discipline for searching both the academic literature as well as experiments that have worked in the field to find out what works. There's a lot of challenges with RCTs, which I won't go into because Angus Deaton and Nancy Cartwright have done a great job of this in multiple publications recently. These are writing about the limits and the equity challenges of randomized control trials. There are, of course, other kinds of academic studies that are not RCTs, but there are plenty of things that are also not the write-up or the product of academic study at all. So I've written recently in SSIR about the need to try to bridge this world of RCTs and social innovation and develop a discipline for searching both literatures, what works in the field, what works in practice, as well as what is documented to work based on academic studies. Okay, last quick 2 stages here. We need to also focus on how do we use engagement and data to help us in implementing what works. So DFAT in Australia, famously for a number of years, had something called the Innovation Exchange, where they partnered with people outside of government to be able to implement solutions to development challenges. They did it both because they didn't have the money, and they did it because they got expertise from working with private sector institutions who could help them really launch startups and pilot projects in the development context to be able to tackle a number of different challenges. One last example here, one of my recent favorites, the city of Lakewood, Colorado. There's one guy there named Jonathan Wachtel, who's the city's sole urban planner, who got tired of the limits of what he could do as one person. So he developed a program called the Sustainable Neighborhoods Program, and now he's got 20,000 residents doing 500 different projects relating to sustainability in this community of 150,000 people. So what's great about this is, again, there's very little that he could implement working by himself, but working across a network and with the crowd, he's been able to take advantage of collective action by working differently to be able to get more done. And now they've scaled this to a number of neighborhoods all across Colorado. Lastly is obviously the phase that we often pay the least attention to, which is evaluation, where we generally, write up the study 3 years after the fact, where we're seeing some real, again, experimentation, innovation in the space. So Urs Gasser at Harvard, now at Munich, and I worked on a simple project, which is to help the German federal government put up their federal artificial intelligence strategy a year or two ago, and to crowdsource the drafting of a second version of that strategy. So to get them, very unusually for the Germans, to do a version 1, and then to be willing to innovate, take input, improve it, and do a version 2. There's been lots of examples in places like Chile, where they have for a long time, not involving technology, but now increasingly online, been using focus groups to study what's working and what's not working with policies after they've been implemented. And in Helsinki, they are using, again, a larger distributed crowd to help them evaluate their success on the implementation of 145 different climate goals in a project called the Climate Watch Project. So all of these are about new ways of working, involving the use of data and involving the use of collaboration in order to be more effective at implementing change. And I think that's really got to be the focus here, is the question of teaching people, how do we actually go from idea to implementation, not simply coming up with the new idea, but actually being able to implement those ideas in practice. And that's why I think coming back, the skills are so vitally important, not the skills kind of separately or disconnected. And you see a lot in terms of past efforts at government training that tend to focus on what I call the bright, shiny object. So let's teach behavioral insights, or let's teach data, or let's teach one thing, but at the expense of teaching something else. And what I think is so exciting about the approaches that you take there and that I take in my own teaching is to say we have to connect these things into an renewed process of policy analysis, a 21st century version of policy analysis that connects the qualitative and the quantitative, taking advantage of digital tools to be able to get us more quickly and more equitably from idea to implementation. So we've done a lot of empirical research in the last 2 years on this question, studying the diffusion of skills among public servants around the world. And we're, I think, going to do our 6th country study about skills. This is a very rudimentary summary of what is essentially data from 6 different countries. The upshot of it is basically, even when people know what these skills are, the diffusion of skills is very uneven. And the diffusion of skills is very, very uneven in practice. But once people receive some training and exposure to how to use these different approaches, that frequency of use of those skills goes way up. So people, once they learn how to define a problem, then use it all the time. Ditto with agile and data analytical methods and human-centered methods, et cetera. There's more about some of this in the first survey that we did in Australia in a report that we did for the Australia New Zealand School of Government. So the most forward-leaning governments are rethinking how they are training people. So you have governments like Canada or Germany that are creating whole of government new training strategies to be able to diffuse the teaching of both quantitative and qualitative skills. In Argentina, whereas they started initially only by teaching human-centered design, they're now combining it with the teaching of data to help create, again, more agile, I think, effective problem solvers. And in New Jersey, one of the first things I did when I took this job was to get the governor to let me agree to start a free training program for public servants. And now, thanks to some philanthropic support, we are teaching people across 5 states and rapidly expanding that across other states. California is one of our participating states in this free training program. We have to, however, back this up sooner and earlier than just waiting till people get into government. That's why I'm so excited and honored to have been at a conference that you guys organized out of Stanford now, I think it's 3 years ago, it predates COVID, about what is the 21st century curriculum for people in public administration. And there was some phenomenal work done at that very conference to put forward the idea that we have to teach public problem solving, we have to teach complex problem solving to people in new ways, revamping what we mean by policy analysis, I think not just in schools and programs of public administration, but across all disciplines these days. There's a huge demand for it. Students, as you know, want to learn how to do well by doing good. They're interested in learning how to be mission-driven leaders. And so I think learning about these new approaches is extraordinarily important. So let me close by saying that obviously we also need to focus on how these individual skills roll up into new strategies for how we govern institutions. So what are the culture of institutions that we create? How do we organize institutions? There's a lot of interesting models out there in terms of the way that different countries, whether it's in the UK or in the UAE or Japan, or in very excitingly, by the way, the place I would point you to is Bangladesh, probably doing some of the most interesting and transformative work in terms of transformational uses of technology to service and serve people better. But there's really interesting work going on, and but I think that we cannot get to these institutional strategies, we cannot get to the policy changes if we don't at the same time address individual skills and competencies at the same time. We have to do this, and it's urgent because we have a lot of wicked problems we have to solve. We have 17 of them if you ask the UN, and I don't know if you break down the sub goals, how many they add up to, but we have a lot of challenges we have to address. We have acute challenges, of course, like COVID, and we have acute challenges obviously relating to climate, like wildfires. But we also have the chronic long-term challenges of climate change, of racial justice, of economic inequality, and probably, of course, the challenge that maybe is the biggest one that underlies them all, the crisis that we are experiencing of governance. So we have big problems we have to tackle. And I would encourage us to say that we need to focus on how we train people inside government and outside government so that more people can become public problem solvers. or what Eleanor Ostrom would have called the public entrepreneur. So the person who works in different ways to be able to more effectively change the world in the 21st century. So let me leave you on that optimistic note to say that I think it can be done and it should be done. And in many places it is happening. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that amazing presentation. For anyone who's joining us on Zoom, if you have questions, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box. Anyone here who asks a question, if you could introduce yourself first, that would be great. I would love to ask the first question, which is, do you have evidence from these different reforms and sort of policy adaptations and changes that there has been a corresponding increase in trust in government, either at the local level or state or national, however these, wherever the reform happened, did that lead the public to change its attitudes or even just to attribute the change? Like, did they recognize that it had happened? Did they think it was successful, et cetera?
So I think, it's a really, really interesting question about also how do we study and connect the dots on the ways in which training, for example, translates into trust. So it's a multi-step process, right? Because you have to train people to work differently. They then have to apply those skills in how they do their work. That has to lead to more effective solutions, and that in turn has to translate into the question of whether that changes how people trust government. So in part, some of those questions are very longitudinal, large-scale questions that will take time to study. But that said, there are lots of interim, I think, metrics where we really can connect the dots that include things like, again, whether people who learn these skills then find that they're applying them and that they use them in their work, whether they're useful to them. Whether then in turn, the people who do those things are able to do projects differently and better that lead to real outcomes. So we can determine whether, for example, by working differently and putting up that COVID-19 website in a very different way than government typically does something, we have a great metric in the form of 1 million users a week who then use that site. So in a state of 8.8 million people, to have 165 million unique users of a project tells us we're doing something right when it comes to that. Then the question of, did Phil Murphy getting reelected have anything to do with the COVID-19 website? That's a difficult question that I think people in this room can help us to answer. I think, there's some big other, the reason Phil Murphy does or doesn't get reelected also has to do with things like Biden and what's happening at the national level. It doesn't just have to do with the COVID-19 website. But I do think that the on balance, the sort of effective response that you saw in the state in terms of how it handled COVID. And by the way, it's a lot more than just one website. It's everything, including, licensing out-of-state medical professionals so that we can bring in enough doctors, or allowing mental health professionals to practice online, being able to use data, again, to predict the spread of the virus, to bring down, and what do we used to call it, flatten the curve. It's policies around mask wearing. So it's a very complex set of things, but there is a through line between governments that have seen better rates of trust. And I didn't show you a slide, actually I probably should have put in, about those countries that have actually seen increased rates of trust during COVID, that I think do correlate to improved ways of working and more effective responses during the pandemic. But I think, I am guessing people here will have things to say about that. So it's not quite as simple as use data and you will get reelected, because that's not true. I do think, though, there are much more granular interim metrics, like use data, build tool X, or deliver policy Y that's more responsive to people's needs, and see more satisfied users of that policy or benefit. So did people take up the benefit? Or was money left on the table? Were people satisfied with the particular service that they get? So we do have things like, we used a lot of these approaches and methods and revamped how motor vehicles deliver services to people. And you see a dramatic increase in trust of motor vehicles. Yes. So all that to say, we probably have to break it down in a more granular level rather than make sweeping pronouncements like, take training course, get reelected. But the answer is yes, and I think we'll understand better over time both how to study this and have better data on this.
Great, thanks. All right, I too.
Thank you very much. My name is Aytu. I'm a postdoc at CDDRL. Thank you very much for the inspiring presentation. I want to ask you about one of the solutions that you created and you mentioned in the presentation. This like symptom checker website, which is leading to decisions on where to distribute the ventilators, which probably save lots of lives, which is great. Can you tell a little bit more about this? Just like how much time did you require to create this website? How many people worked on it? Because I think it's a great public policy solution. But the other question is, couldn't Google have done this very easily, just like by looking at the searches on whether, like, do I have COVID type of search? So did you really need to create a new website for this? So weren't there also like alternative solutions to solve this problem?
So one of the things you raise, there's a really, let me give you a straightforward answer, and then there's a complicated, interesting thing that you raise in here. The straightforward answer to how it got built was, it was me and another guy, and it's basically just a Qualtrics form. I cannot tell you how many things we did during the pandemic that were basically just making forms, that ended up, taking us literally, I mean, this was, it was such a quick project to build, that it was the question, partly in answer to your question, is why not do it if it's so simple? I will tell you that things like this was a much more effective project than the Google, Apple digital contact tracing initiative, or things that were much bigger and more complicated, where we said, oh, let's defer to the private sector to do it. I'll tell you the other reason we had to do this as opposed to Google. And by the way, the CDC also had a symptom tracker as well. This worked in two directions. You put in your symptoms, and it told you what you should do. And we changed that advice depending on how the guidance changed. So there was a point in the pandemic when if you had a sniffle or a fever or cough, we told you to stay home. There was a later point in the pandemic when we told you to get tested, but you might recall for a long time we had no tests. So we weren't telling you to get tested because we didn't have a way to test you. So we would tell you to stay home, or we would tell you to go see your doctor, or then we had tests. So then we would tell you to go to get tested. So it was not only designed as a data gathering tool. It was designed as a way to actually push out public health messages that were customized to your symptoms and localized. So that was very local information. So like, here is where your testing site is, or here is, where your pharmacy is. That was extremely local. So that was the reason to do this, as opposed to rely on some global, some global project, number one. Number two, one of the big challenges, and we met with the Googles and Apples of the world at the time, and I think they changed how they did things over time. But initially, the reason we needed to do this was because the state needed this information. So yes, we wanted to tell you to go get tested or wear a mask or see your doctor, but we wanted that data, frankly, so that we could do the predictive analytics on the spread of the virus. And so at the time when the private sector entities started doing this, they didn't really have a conception of how to communicate back to public health authorities. They weren't thinking about the public sector or institutions. They were thinking about this as a purely private sector, individualized solution. And the public health authorities were really left out of the mix. So we needed a way to ensure that that information was getting to local and county health authorities so that they could adjust accordingly, so that the police could literally go and drive a ventilator from here to there. We also had a legal order in place to requisition ventilators. So if you had a ventilator and you were, let's say, in construction, but you had a ventilator for construction purposes, we would take it from you and take it to a hospital on an emergency basis. Anyway, I think it gets into a much bigger, more interesting question about when the public sector, divisions between the public and private sector, and whether the public sector should be involved in building certain tools or should not be building them. And this touches on the work that your colleagues are doing around this challenge of tech sector optimization and the desire, when we really want the public sector to be involved because it safeguards the public trust, as opposed to the high quality products and technologies you'll get from the private sector, but that are organized around the wrong values. So this touches a lot on the sorry, now I'm blanking on the title of of the book. You'll remind me. Rob and Jeremy is in the book. It's
System error.
System error. Thank you. That's what I'm talking about. Sorry. It's the last place I should forget the title, but it's because I'm talking to you. I can count on you to remember.
Okay, so we've got a few more questions, and we'll try to get to some on the Zoom Q&A as well. So I have,
and I'll be briefer.
I have Sam, Frank, and then Brett, and then Dinsha. All right, Sam.
Awesome. Hi, Beth. Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I have a couple of big picture questions. When we think about government and working with data, that also raises questions about privacy for me, and how you kind of balance the need for more data in government to inform policy, but then protecting privacy rights. So how do you find that balance? And then secondly, as we work with more and more data, and we start to bring in like AI and other kinds of tools for analysis, how do we combat risks around issues of discrimination, for example? Because we already know a lot of the AI processes that are used across various sectors of government and society can lead to bias, discrimination, and injustice for certain segments of population. So how would we think about this in the context of government to ensure fairness and equality?
Oh, easy questions. How much time I said I was going to be brief. Now you'll have to hold me to it. So the yes, responsible data use, responsible AI use, frameworks for for transparency and accountability and how we think about these things is the top line message. But I think part of the top line is also that the academy is, and I say this lovingly as somebody who is in the academy, we spend a lot of time focused on questions of what not to do, and we have got to be engaged because the data is getting used, the AI is getting rolled out. We have to be focused on how to balance the risks and how to do things responsibly. Because we can have a debate about the symptom tracker, for example, but I think that giving data to public health authorities in an anonymized way, and this was all anonymized, that enabled us to save lives by predicting the spread of the virus, on balance is a good thing. But we had to think about how to do it, and that it would be anonymized in how we collected that data, and to be very careful about who would have access to that data, and to be careful about what we asked people. So I think it's about really those very careful practices. It's why we're wrestling with a project now, and I'll tell you, it gets back to the question that was just asked. We have a project we started building before the pandemic to create a digital coaching tool for the unemployed. So it uses behavioral insights to give you advice about your job search process. And it's based on a lot of research from academics who have done work on face-to-face coaching with people, and lots of insights about how coaching and mentoring can help people who are unemployed to get back to work faster. So in order to do effective coaching, we have to gather we have to know something about you, because you don't want one size fits all advice. We want to be able to customize that advice to you, but that means gathering data about you. Obviously in a way that's with your consent and fully transparent, but it gets back to this question and why we as the state are getting involved in building these tools as opposed to just saying, we'll let the private sector do it. We also want to make sure that the advice you're getting is not based on we're not commercial recommendations based on trying to sell you a product, but are there to genuinely provide you with the best available insights about what you can and should do, the way you would get public health, unbiased public health guidance. So it's this balance between how do we build something that's really good and well designed from a usability perspective, which the public sector isn't so good at, and balance that with the kinds of privacy, security, autonomy, and human rights questions, Sam, that you're raising. So I think the long story short is this stuff is, data will get used and should get used, and AI is and will and should get used, especially to enable people to participate in more democratic and equitable ways. I think use of technology can help to make things much fairer for people when used right. But we need those kinds of safeguards, and that's why we need Rob teaching, writing system failure and teaching students that optimization is not the only value that we want to go for. So it gets back to this concept of education and training. I'd like to think that we're doing something right by investing in how we teach people to ask the hard questions. But these are hard problems.
Frank?
Well, so Beth, we're involved in the same struggle here, so it was really great to hear your presentation. So my question is really about that last issue. How do we make public policy, public administration great again? Right? It used to be one of the 4 subdivisions within the field of political science, but then it was pushed out, I think largely because of the influence of the economist that didn't take seriously the kinds of issues that you're talking about. And right now, public policy education or training to go into government is in a really bad condition in this country. A lot of public administration programs have shut down. It doesn't have much prestige. It's hard to get students interested in this. So at that conference that you mentioned, we drafted a manifesto saying this, we ought to do this. I spent a lot of time trying to get the Chronicle of Higher Education to cover our manifesto. I couldn't do it. And in the end, that effort sort of petered out. So what do we do now? I mean, how do we, there's a huge need for training people that can go into government and solve problems. So what do we do next?
First, I'm very gratified to know that if Frank Fukuyama can't get something placed in the Chronicle of Education, it makes me feel better, because I tried to place something around this question of public problem solving and I couldn't get them interested either. And I couldn't understand why. It was really puzzling to me. But then again, it is more interesting to read who are the highest paid university presidents than to read about policy problems, I suppose. So I think the answer. So one answer is, I think we're limiting ourselves by focusing on public administration. At least in my own work that I'm doing, I'm trying to work on teaching people across disciplines and get them interested. I think there are people interested in going into government, but oddly, they're not in public administration. And I think, I don't know whether Rob and Jeremy and Mehran feel similarly in terms of who sits in your classroom, but it's the engineers, it's the students studying design, it's the students who are, interested in, making a dent in the universe and introducing them to government as a lever of change. Not that I'm giving up, the conference you ran was inspiring in terms of shifts in education and public administration, but I do think that there's a broader audience who are interested in going into government. And I think COVID and Black Lives Matter have only fed this desire for people to do mission-driven work. And so there's a moment in time we need to seize by introducing people to this concept that you could go work for a city, or you could go work for a state, or you could go work for a federal government, and that there are exciting opportunities. That said, I'll give you one quick, I'm going to contradict myself for a second. This is on topic, off topic. There's a fellowship called Govern for America that some of you may be familiar with, that like a Teach for America, gets college students going into state government to do 2-year stints after graduation. And I was coaching the students from that fellowship, or former students from that fellowship, and they said, we hate you because you're telling us about all this innovative stuff, and we are first-year bureaucrats on the bottom of the totem pole in Louisiana state government, and it is a pretty miserable job. So it's not so It's not so easy to get people going into government because not all the jobs look like working for the Office of Innovation or look like working for United States Digital Service or 18F, et cetera. So I would say the jobs often are awful, but there are an increasing number of these innovation teams, data shops, even retrograde agencies are now, our comptroller's office in New Jersey has now stood up a data team. Our attorney's general office has now created an innovation office. Everybody wants one of these. So as more of these proliferate, I do think we'll create more opportunities for people to get excited about going into government, and we're just going to have to figure out how to tell that story.
All right.
So
Okay.
commiserate.
We have 10 minutes left today, so I'm going to just group Brett and Dinsh's questions together. Is that okay, Beth? All right.
Great, fantastic. I enjoyed the presentation very, very much, and I'm keen to read the book. So I would like to, ask the elephant in the room, at least I think of the elephant in the room question. I mean, in some sense, you're on home turf here, right? I think we're all favorable of this idea, that sort of data analytics are good, and we should sort of import those into into local and state national government. But I mean, obviously, it's the case that many Americans are skeptical, right? I mean, about the role of science and expertise, and and even as I think you mentioned earlier, the very role of government in solving these major public problems. So I was kind of curious to what extent you found that receptivity to kind of these ideas about importing data analytics. To what extent it's kind of receptivity to those ideas is driven or varies by kind of state or local government bipartisanship. To what extent is there sort of variation in whether or in the magnitude of salaries even that local and state governments are willing to provide to to sort of data analysts, and to the extent that you sort of have found variation in that, what might we be able to do about that?
Right, and Dinsha.
I've got actually a very similar question. I was just wondering, I mean, I'm totally on board with all of this technocratic stuff. I feel like the politics are missing. If you were trying to do this in Florida, not only would you have been fired, but you might have been facing criminal charges with COVID. There was that lady there who faced those issues. And then when we talk about trying to motivate students to come in to government, just as you mentioned, some places, I mean, it just doesn't seem like there's much of an appetite for expanding the bureaucracy the way we would like it to be.
Yeah, so this is, I'm expecting it's sort of, you might know Godwin's law, which used to be sort of the number of minutes before somebody mentions Hitler. I think we should call it Trump's law, which is the number of minutes before somebody mentions the Republican Party. Right, so when I alluded at the outset to the flaws or whatnot, the thing I meant was, at some point you should be saying, well, what about the Trump Republican Party? Like, what about politics in all of this? And is that a flaw here? And I will tell you, so again, we have 10 minutes to solve this. I can't solve the Republican Party problem in 10 minutes. But let me sort of begin a response as follows. It's one of the reasons why I'm talking about and emphasizing not simply what are these new ways of working, but the idea of how to teach people to apply these skills. Which is about teaching people how, in a highly politicized environment, how in a highly bureaucratic environment, you can actually apply these skills in your own work. So I don't think it's enough to just go, yay, data, yippee, or yay, human-centered design. Of course, it's self-evident, you should talk to citizens, super. Nowadays, we had to articulate the value proposition for using data 10 years ago. After COVID, like you don't have to justify the use of data anymore. Privacy, yes, we have to worry about that, but I don't think you have to kind of sell people on the use of data in the way that you would have had to do 10 years ago. But how do I do these things in practice against the fact that we don't have agreements about what the problems are that we're solving, let alone what the solutions should be? You have highly fractured, fractious, politicized environments. You have budget shortages. You have, you're somewhere on the so far down on the totem pole that you don't necessarily have permission. There's a broad range of reasons why it's very hard to implement these things in practice, which is why when I'm talking about a discipline and a skill for teaching problem solving, it's teaching it in a highly politicized context for how you do these things. It's about often defining problems very, very narrowly so that you can achieve quick wins. It's why in a place like South Australia, they have a defined concept and a unit of government called the 90-day project team, which is designed on helping you to create very focused projects so you can execute very rapidly. So all that to say, this is not, it's not about kind of, sort of value, sort of skills in the abstract, but really skills set against a very real backdrop of how things work in practice. It's why on a personal level, I have worked for both right-wing and left-wing administrations, precisely to be able to explore and to demonstrate that we can still do these things. I have done some wackadoodle projects with some very right-wing people in Texas that I normally, I have no agreement with politically, but with whom then when you can identify and when you can come to an understanding of the kinds of things you want to focus on, you can actually execute on something. Pew Research has some really great data essentially on how fundamentally on a set of core issues, there are definitely things at the fringes, but there's a set of core issues where Americans really largely agree about things. And in those spaces, and yes, they may be somewhat technocratic, we can actually get together to agree on better ways to take out the trash or better ways to reduce traffic. It's why we just did a project across 5 cities in Mexico that had 5 different mayors from different political parties, and we're able to work collectively on solving a set of urban challenges together. So anyway, it's a hard and long topic, and it isn't. I don't want to say this is to the exclusion of fixing problems like the Electoral College and anti-majoritarian tendencies in the Senate, or sort of the nature of how the media covers politics as opposed to covering governance. There's lots of other things we need to work on, but I do think that we can teach people in practice how to apply these skills in highly politicized environments, and I've seen it work, and I think we can do more of it.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions on the Zoom. I'm going to try to sort of group them together.
Sorry, yes.
Oh, no, that's okay. We're not going to get to all of them. But Samitra Jha, who's a professor at the GSB and one of our affiliates, is asking about a lot of interest in social impact work here at Stanford, like Fact Sparrow, trying to provide an easy way to fact check Twitter with experts, similar to how you used the Federation of American Scientists. What do you think are the most effective models for bringing in private sector collaborations? I know you've already talked about this a little bit before, but a lot of the questions are getting at, practically, how do you, either working in government or someone who's interested in going to government from the private sector, really try to merge these worlds effectively?
So I love the question and the project example, and I think it's something like the Federation of American Scientists project had a very clear set of rules. What Barry Wellman, the sociologist in Toronto, and Lee Rainey in their book that they wrote called Networked describe as the choreography essentially of collaboration. So I think there are better and worse ways to organize equitable, whether you want to call them crowdsourcing or collaboration or these kind of networked projects that take advantage of the power of the crowd. That are highly transparent in the way that they work, that are very clear about the way they use people's expertise and their contributions, that have a feedback loop back to participants about how their input will and won't get used, and are very clear about the model of democracy that they're promoting. So there are projects that are about what you might call direct democracy. So the crowd gets to vote on something. I think a lot of these things like a Fact Sparrow or the Federation of American Scientists or a PolitiFact kind of project are not models of direct democracy. They are about really gathering information to better inform a decision, They're really a much more participatory, a deliberative approach to democratic participation. And as long as we're clear about that, I think those projects tend to work extremely effectively and help otherwise beleaguered government people to really get a lot more done. So I think they're pretty exciting, and I love especially what they're doing in Helsinki with a lot of these techniques.
All right, fantastic. Well, that's time, but thank you so much, Beth, for this presentation and for this fantastic book and all of this great work that you're doing. And thanks for joining us, albeit only virtually. We look forward to interacting again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. With apologies to the people on the Zoom that the questions in the room were so interesting. I wasn't following the Q&A, but you are welcome to point people to me and to distribute the presentation. And I'm always an open book and happy to share and to follow up with anybody online.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Take care.